Welcome to Legacy Magazine Presents Black Health, a weekly talk show discussing medical issues afflicting and impacting the Black community. Now introducing our host, Dr. Michelle Kirwan Blythewood.
Good afternoon and welcome to Black Health. I am the host of Black Health, Dr. Michelle Kirwan Blythewood. I am a board-certified pediatrician and the Chief Medical Officer at the Pediatric and Family Health and Wellness Center in Miami Gardens, Florida. Today, we are going to be talking about sickle cell disease. So if you or someone you know or someone you love has sickle cell disease or even sickle cell trait, you will want to stay tuned. We're going to answer the question for you. Is there a cure on the horizon for sickle cell disease? And to talk to us today, we have an expert in the subject, Dr. Patrick Hines. Dr. Hines, welcome to the show. We're happy to have you here today. Thank you for coming on.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. I'm going to take a moment and introduce you. So Dr. Patrick Hines completed his pediatrics residency and fellowship in critical care medicine at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He received his medical degree and PhD in pharmacology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Hampton University. He has spent 20 years investigating the mechanisms regulating blood flow in sickle cell disease. He has authored numerous publications in this field and is internationally recognized for his efforts. And we're going to talk a little bit about a company called Functional Fluidics that Dr. Hines opened in 2014. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But first, Dr. Hines, tell us what led you to the field of intensive care medicine, pediatric intensive care unit medicine, and why the interest in sickle cell disease?
So first, thank you again, Dr. Curran, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to get to connect with you, and really awesome to see this wonderful show that you have and to be able to be a part of it. I went into critical care medicine because I think I'm a bit of an impatient person, and unlike kind of the outpatient environment where you practice, I really needed a lot more sort of rapid feedback on patients that were having some type of critical illness and being able to intervene and see the progress of them moving from illness to wellness over a shorter period of time. And I was able to capture that in the ICU setting. So it was a much more comfortable setting for me to practice medicine. I really love the practice of ICU medicine, seeing kids that 99% of the time they come in sick, but they get better. And you're able to see them walk out and have a little bit to do with them getting back to their normal state of health. And that's just like the greatest reward in the world. So it's a wonderful thing to do. Sickle cell disease was something that I had committed to much earlier than that, though. When I was at the University of North Carolina doing the MD PhD program, my PhD work was in a lab that was studying the health and function of red blood cells. And the main indication for this was people living with sickle cell disease. And back at that time, there wasn't a lot of work being done in this area. Mainly what we were doing for people with sickle cell disease was treating pain, but we saw an opportunity to think about sickle cell disease much like we do cardiovascular disease. We measure blood pressure as a surrogate for cardiovascular outcomes we want to avoid. And we saw red blood cell health the same way. We can measure a way to keep red blood cells healthy. That might give us an opportunity to keep patients healthier. And it's been something that I've been interested in my whole career. So that's really what led to the interest in sickle cell disease.
I didn't know that. I've known you for many years, and I didn't know that you were studying sickle cell before you became a doctor. And thank goodness for those of you like you that want to go into intensive care medicine, because there are those of us that just like a 9 to 5 and keep things simple and straightforward and have all the patience in the world to just go the slow route. I prefer the slower route and the calmer route of being in the outpatient setting. So thank goodness for people who want to do that intense work. So thank you. So let's jump into it. What is sickle cell disease and how common is it?
Yeah, so sickle cell disease, it's a single gene disorder that affects a protein in our red blood cells called hemoglobin. And by affecting that hemoglobin with a single point mutation in our DNA, it replaces an amino acid in that protein. And the bottom line is that hemoglobin now begins to function abnormally. So what is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a protein in our red blood cells that carries oxygen and releases oxygen to the places where it needs to go, which is great if you're a non-sickle cell person. But if you have sickle cell disease, when red blood cells release that oxygen after it gets to where it needs to go, it now has this property that causes these hemoglobin molecules to stick together. And that forms these long chains of hemoglobin that it is the reason it has this name, sickle cell disease. Those red blood cells begin to become shaped in a sickle-like form. And there's all other kind of shapes that you can see. But the point is the red blood cells are behaving badly. They're not doing the thing they're supposed to do. They're not getting to the places where oxygen needs to be delivered. And so anywhere that's touched by red blood cells, which is practically everywhere in our body, can potentially be affected. And that's why sickle cell disease can be such a bad disease that we really need to invest a lot more time and resources in figuring out how to treat.
It is very prevalent in the Black community. Why is that? Is race a proxy for sickle cell disease? Is it directly linked to our race, or is it something else?
That's a great question, Dr. Curran. So it is associated certainly in the United States with African Americans, but it's not just by the nature of us being Black people. It's because genetically we come from areas where malaria is endemic, right? So places like sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, the Caribbean, but also places like Southeast Asia and India. So when you look at the scope of where sickle cell disease is prevalent, it's not just places where people of African origin live, but people in areas where malaria is endemic. So why does sickle cell exist there? Because the gene for sickle cell disease can be protective if you have sickle cell trait, which doesn't manifest as the disease as we know it. And we'll talk more about that. But folks that have the trait for sickle cell disease, if you live in one of these areas where malaria is endemic, can actually be protective to some degree. And if you're protected from malaria, then you're more likely to pass on your genes and pass on that sickle cell gene so that it continues to live in the environment. That's the reason why you tend to see it in the United States and mainly African Americans. Of the 100,000 people in the United States that have sickle cell disease, is because of our sort of geographic origin, not simply by nature of the fact that we're Black.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up for us, because I think many people think it's just a Black disease, so to speak. So what are the symptoms of sickle cell disease?
The one that you hear most about, Dr. Curran, is pain. And that's really the tip of the iceberg. But it's what people think about in medical school and in our training, is that's what you look for, is that people with sickle cell disease both live with chronic pain and these very sudden episodes that we call vaso-occlusive crises. Vasal being vessel, occlusive meaning blocked by these damaged red blood cells, and crises meaning this is a horrible situation that we want to avoid. So by having these crises events, they can cause these acute bouts of pain that can be debilitating and cause people to have to go to the emergency department. But anywhere where red blood cells flow can be impacted by sickle cell disease. So we see lung disease, like acute chest crises. We can see damage to vision because the blood vessels in the eye are affected. And we can also see problems in other areas like the liver and the spleen. One second.
My wife has not got it. And it's 10 after 2. We're just wondering if you know when she's coming, because
she's on the way.
Okay, thank you.
I apologize. So
No
I
worries.
had my son's pediatrician's appointment, but nothing will prevent me from participating in an interview with Dr. Curran. So we are
appreciate
creative
you
and
taking one
flexible
for
and know
the
how to make
team.
things happen.
Listen, you're doing this in the middle of your son's pediatric appointment, and I'm a pediatrician, so I can really appreciate the scenario that you are in right now. I
Well, if
completely
he
get it.
misses it, I'm going to have him come to see you when we're down in Miami.
First appointment available. First appointment. So you mentioned pain, and I just wanted to tell this little story that just always stuck out to me in residency. We had a patient, a sickler, come in pain just into the emergency room. He thought he was having a mild sickle cell crisis. He was having arm pain. And when they took an x-ray of his arm, he had actually broken his arm. He had a fracture, and he considered that to be mild sickle cell crisis. And that always
Right.
struck me, like, then what does sickle cell crisis feel like if it's worse than breaking your arm? So that just always stayed in my head, about sickle cell.
That's a great story, Michelle, because I think people don't appreciate the severity of the pain that these folks live with every day, and the fact that with this pain, how bad it must be when they come into an emergency setting to get help. It is pain that you or I or folks who don't live with this pain could not even imagine. So that's a great representation of what that pain feels like.
Yeah, and then to have to live with that from time to time in your life for the duration of your life is just incredible. How and when is sickle cell diagnosed?
So today, sickle cell should be diagnosed at birth in every state in the United States due to newborn screening. But unfortunately, around the world, it's not always diagnosed at birth because there's many places where malaria is endemic, and you see a lot of sickle cell disease where they don't have the facilities and the resources to do newborn screening. So one of my mentors and legends in the sickle cell disease research area, Dr. Ohini from Pong, um, at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, had done a number of things to get newborn screening as a part of to be much more accessible in Ghana, for example, where we see a lot of sickle cell disease. And through those efforts, that's began to expand into other areas in Africa. And Dr. Frimpong passed away, and I definitely want to sort of acknowledge the role he's played in my career and development. But in terms of getting newborn screening available globally, he was one of the leaders in that. But that's when we should be diagnosing it is at birth because we've got the technology to do that.
Sorry, I believe I'm muted.
Okay.
You mentioned pain as one of the symptoms and acute chest syndrome. So I think one of the things that people are unaware of about sickle cell is that it can affect so many parts of the body, so much of our daily function. Hearing, it can affect our hearing. It can even lead to erectile dysfunction, blood clots, strokes, brain aneurysms, seizures, eyes. So talk to us a little bit about some of the areas of the body that people may not be as familiar with that can be affected by sickle cell disease.
That's right. I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Curran, because people tend to think about pain as like the only thing we have to worry about in sickle cell disease. But it's truly the tip of the iceberg. The pain that people experience is literally ischemia from blood not flowing to the parts of the body that are in pain. So if you imagine that, imagine the things that are downstream from that. So blood flowing to your blood vessels in the eye. That's why we have sickle retinopathy. Blood flowing from to organs like the lungs, which can impact acute chest syndrome, which is one of the major causes of mortality in people with sickle cell disease. And the brain, right? Young children, before you have pain, that abnormal blood circulation affects brain development and growth, and not just strokes, right? Strokes are, again, tip of the iceberg. But before strokes, there's silent strokes. There's parts of the brain parenchyma that don't receive enough oxygen. So you've got learning difficulties. You've got psychological issues. And those type of things that are more subtle. But if this is your child, that's a big deal. That's the development. That's the developing brain not receiving the blood flow and oxygen that it needs at a critical point in their life where you can't replace that. That's one of the reasons I'm so adamant that we need to think about endpoints to assess in people with sickle cell disease that are much earlier than those clinical manifestations that we talk about. Pain is far too late. We shouldn't even be talking about. By the time someone has pain, we have missed so many opportunities to improve their situation. We've got to get down to the organ level, and ultimately, where my interest is, down to the cellular level, where we can keep those cells healthy so that none of these other in organ complications even have the opportunity to occur.
What about cardiac health? Can it affect the heart?
Absolutely. So the heart in people with sickle cell disease generally has to beat much faster because they're anemic, right? So one of the things that this causes in this red blood cell damage is the destruction of red blood cells. And the heart tries to maintain a certain amount of output to the body. But if the red blood cells are low, now the heart has to beat a lot faster for your entire life to try to make up for that lack of oxygen carrying capacity, right? So that can tire a heart out, so to speak. The other interesting thing that happens, Dr. Curran, is that when red blood cells are destroyed and they release this hemoglobin protein, it affects the blood vessels in a molecule that causes our blood vessels to relax, called nitric oxide, is sort of sponged up, so to speak. And when that happens, those blood vessels that the heart has to pump against can become stiffer. If those are pulmonary blood vessels, the right side of your heart, which is the weaker, thinner part of the heart, has to pump against a higher pressure in the pulmonary vessels, which can lead to something called pulmonary hypertension, which ultimately can lead to right heart failure. And that's another one of the major causes of morbidity in people with sickle cell disease.
Why do sicklers lose their spleen early?
So people living with sickle cell disease have a lot of blood flow through their spleen. The spleen's job is really to clear a lot of dying cells from the body. And if you've got a lot of sick cells, and red blood cells, remember, is the most abundant cellular component of our blood. So that's a lot of work on the spleen. So the spleen can often get sequestered and take in a lot of red blood cells and get really, really enlarged. In the context of a crisis, those blood cells can become trapped in the spleen and drop blood counts pretty quickly. Having this happen repeatedly over time can cause the spleen to become functionally abnormal, and it doesn't function like the spleen should. So many people with sickle cell disease are functionally asplenic, meaning there can be a spleen that's there, but it's not really doing the job it's supposed to do. And a lot of people with sickle cell disease actually have their spleens surgically removed to address this issue.
Is there an increased risk of infection in sickle cell?
There is. One of the things that our spleen does is it helps to protect us from infections caused by encapsulated bacteria. So things like strep pneumonia. So when you don't have a functioning spleen, you're at higher risk from infections from these special type of bacteria called encapsulated bacteria.
So I mentioned earlier erectile dysfunction, and I know the men watching this are kind of going, wait, what? What are you talking about? So I know priapism is something that if it continuously occurs, can lead to erectile dysfunction. So just give us a little quick scenario about that.
That's right. That's something that often we don't talk enough about because it can be a taboo area and an uncomfortable area to talk about. But this is a serious medical condition, and it's something called priapism, which is different as we classically think about erectile dysfunction. But it is a type of erectile dysfunction, and it's when you have a painful erection that lasts for a long period of time. And that's because blood cannot be removed from the erect penis the way it's supposed to be, and that can cause damage to the penile tissue. And this is a problem that many men with sickle cell disease suffer from, and it can be very debilitating.
Yeah. So a lot of other parts of the body, not just pain, that can be affected with sickle cell disease. Is there an increase in mortality in patients as they transition from pediatric care to adult care? And why is that? Is just the disease get worse, or is there something else at play there?
Yeah. So, to the credit of pediatricians and pediatric hematologists that take care of kids with sickle cell disease, um, they've done an amazing job building a medical home for kids living with sickle cell disease from infancy until the time they reach adulthood. These are amazing programs that take very good care of people with sickle cell disease. Um, when they become adults, the care system changes significantly. The adult programs do not have that same comprehensive approach to taking care of folks with sickle cell disease. And the other issue is that whereas pediatric health centers tend to be much more localized in a children's hospital or a smaller number of specialized pediatric centers, adult care is administered much more broadly. And many of the people taking care of these adults don't have the same experience and competency in taking care of people with sickle cell disease. So the quality of care they receive is significantly lower in when they transition care, and that can be quite jarring if you have this sort of really comprehensive medical home environment for your entire life, and then you transition to the adult world where that just doesn't exist. Um, it's a big problem and a big sort of drop off in the quality of the care those patients receive. That's one of the reasons you see a lot of morbidity and mortality during that transition phase.
So how do we treat sickle cell? How is it treated?
How is it treated? So sickle cell disease, just to give you some perspective, was the first molecular disease that was we figured out the molecular basis of back in 1949 by Linus Pauling, long time ago. And since then, we've done the same for hemophilia and cystic fibrosis, and there have been a number of therapies that have been developed since the 70s to treat kids with hemophilia and cystic fibrosis, from drug therapies to protein replacement therapies to curative therapies. With sickle cell disease, the FDA didn't approve a drug for the prevention of complications of sickle cell disease until 1998. So 1949, we figure out the cause. 1998, we have our first FDA approval. Imagine the people living with sickle cell disease during that time. And the therapy that was approved was not created for sickle cell disease. It was a repurposed chemotherapy drug called hydroxyurea, which is shown to be very efficacious in people with sickle cell disease by increasing something called fetal hemoglobin. And that's really the standard of care today for sickle cell disease. Now, we're living in a very historic time in sickle cell because there have been a lot of other drugs that have been developed and approved to treat sickle cell disease, such as something called Oxbryta, which increases the way oxygen binds to hemoglobin to prevent sickling. Something called Adakveo, which is a drug that prevents the stickiness of blood cells to the blood vessel, and something called Indari, which reduces the oxidative stress inside red blood cells. And there's a lot of drugs that are in the clinical trials pipeline. So I think the world for people living with sickle cell disease is going to be so much better. The future is so much brighter, but we got to get many of the people who aren't seen at sickle cell centers of excellence where they can get access to these therapies into the network so that we can actually start making sure they get these life-changing therapies.
So is there a cure on the horizon for sickle cell?
I think that there is. We've been doing bone marrow transplantations and stem cell transplantation of sickle cell disease for many years. And there have been mixed results, but we certainly have seen people who have received transplants that are living very healthy lives. But it's not a perfect solution because you have to get the bone marrow from someone who's not yourself, which means that there's the risk, just like with any type of transplant, of rejection and graft versus host disease, which is a bad complication of many different types of transplantation. There's a new technology called gene editing that there's several companies that are working on, which is an amazing therapy where we take the stem cells from a patient with sickle cell disease, and we make changes in the parts of the DNA that code for the damaged hemoglobin, and then we take that person's stem cells and put them back into the patient, and those stem cells begin to produce normally functioning red blood cells. It's an amazing technology. It's still in the early stages of development, but we're hopeful that this could mean a potential cure for folks that have been living with severe sickle cell disease. I think you're mute. I think you're mute. I think you're still on mute, Dr. Curran.
Here I am chatting away. Thank you. So tell us about your.
I was reading your lips. I was still following you.
Tell us about your role,
Sure.
your company that you started, that you founded, that you're the CEO of, Functional Fluidics. How are you? What role are you playing in
Yes.
this?
So this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where I saw how dependent we were on people with sickle cell disease having these clinical manifestations of the disease that I was talking about, the severe pain, the acute chest, that would not only put people in the hospital, but bring people to my ICU. And I just seen, too many folks that presented that way with their disease and have life-threatening complications. And because of my research, I really believe that there was a way that we could measure the health of red blood cells if we had the right testing tools available that would give us the opportunity to use these new medications being developed to keep red blood cells healthy, not just to prevent pain and these really bad clinical events that no one wants to see a patient live through. But similar to the way we do with blood pressure, if my blood pressure is high, we're not going to wait for me to have a heart attack or stroke to intervene with something that puts me at lower risk. Based on that high blood pressure, I don't feel anything. I feel just fine. We're going to give me medication to keep that blood pressure low so that we can prevent me from having that problem. The same opportunity, I think, exists in sickle cell disease if we have the right test. But to make these type of tests available broadly, I couldn't do that as an academic faculty member or even a doctor taking care of one patient at a time. I really had to figure out a way to make this commercially available to any healthcare provider that wanted access to this test to take care of their patients, or any pharmaceutical company developing a therapy for sickle cell disease. And so that's why we founded founded Functional Fluidics, was to develop these tests and to make them available much more broadly than we were able to do just as a faculty member in the university. So that was sort of the reason for starting the company.
Well, again, thank you for all that you are doing for sickle cell in the fight against this disease. We are now at the end of our half hour, so I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Hines, for joining us today. It's been an excellent and very informative show, and I'm hoping that this will touch some of the lives out there, folks with sickle cell disease, and have let them know that there is hope on the horizon for themselves or their loved ones in terms of their potential for a cure. Before we adjourn, I'm going to say a word of thanks to our sponsors. Black Health is brought to you by FAMU Medical Marijuana Education and Research Institute. Get credible information and engage in a safe space to learn and talk about cannabis. Educate, learn, and talk about cannabis in Florida. Once again, Dr. Hines, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to have you, and we hope to have you again in the future. And to everybody listening, we thank you for joining again another episode of Black Health, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Dr. Hines.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.